One of the largest and never-ending arguments on the internet is deciding which is better, Mac or PC. But always notably absent from that conversation is Linux, an operating system that has already been widely adopted in a variety of different ways, but has never quite reached the notoriety of the other two, at least not in the eyes of the average consumer. Why is that? What have they been doing well, and what has kept them from becoming a household name? That and so much more here at Techonomics. Hey, it's Carlos, always trying to provide you with insight on technology and how it's affecting you and the world at large. What makes Linux so interesting is how they have been ridiculously successful in certain specific areas, while in others they have completely dropped the ball and are all but absent in those markets. But before we get into that, let's understand what Linux is and get some context. What is Linux? Well, technically, Linux is just an open source kernel that runs as the core of a wide variety of operating systems. And a kernel is just a program that has complete control over an operating system and is responsible for managing low-level essential tasks. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to tweak that definition a little bit because conventionally, it is not accepted to have such a strict definition. The community of users and developers that help maintain Linux, and this is the definition we're going to use going forward, see any operating system that uses the Linux kernel as a Linux-based operating system. As for a brief history, Linux was first released back in 1991 by its creator, Linus Torvalds, a Finnish software engineer who developed it while still being a student at the University of Helsinki. His goal was to create a Unix-like operating system, Unix being an operating system that was originally released back in 1971, which many operating systems try to build on top of or copy, much like Apple's Mac OS. He succeeded, but it was missing something the GNU system, developed by the GNU project, could provide, that being a virtually endless supply of open source libraries. They ended up complementing each other perfectly, and together they were able to build not just one operating system, but an open source repository by which anyone can build their own. As a result, now you have thousands of Linux-based operating systems that you can install and use totally free. So why doesn't your average consumer know about Linux? And why can't you just purchase a computer that has Linux on it in the same way you can a Windows or a Mac? Well, let's talk about desktop Linux operating systems. Okay, first, let's clarify some things, because the idea that you can't buy a pre-made computer with a Linux-based operating system on it is simply untrue. Some large, well-known manufacturers allow you to buy them right now with their top-of-the-line notebooks like Dell with their XPS 13 or Lenovo with their ThinkPad. And totally apart from that, you have some more niche brands that sell computers with Linux running on them like System 76 or Purism. Now, they definitely have their benefits or their drawbacks just like any other operating system, but the point is they're definitely out there for anyone to purchase. It's just that as of right now, the market is rather small. That said, the reality is that the Linux desktop operating systems just have a ton of drawbacks, or at least they have until relatively recently. Like the user experience, which has just never been at the level of the two major desktop operating systems. For example, Ubuntu version 18.04, which was released back in 2018, looks like this. Now, it's usable, but it just doesn't click the same way as the others. The icons look like they were made back in 2009, and the look and feel of everything from the menu to open applications just looks dated. On top of that, things on a Linux desktop operating system are just way more hands-on. They aren't just one click away like they are on a Mac or a Windows. Oftentimes, you have to open up the terminal and physically type in the commands to execute what you want to do, despite having a perfectly good graphical user interface. Sometimes you even have to do that to do something as simple as install an application. And speaking of applications, Linux does not support some of the most powerful and most used desktop applications, especially the ones for professional use. For example, they don't support the Adobe products like Photoshop or Premiere, which greatly limits their usability for a wide variety of professional users. And many of the applications that they do support, like Word or Excel, are either out of date or not very well supported. Basically, the Linux desktop operating system just does not have the average consumer in mind, which leads to products that, while may be good for specific use cases, does not meet the standards that the general populace has when buying a computer. Which begs the question, in what products does Linux excel? Well, the first place to start is servers. As of right now, Linux controls roughly 43% of the entire server market. But what makes Linux so interesting is that you have several operating systems to choose from under that Linux umbrella. Some of the most popular ones being Debian, Red Hat, or Ubuntu server. But why is it so popular with servers? Well, it's a totally different use case compared to desktop operating systems. First, none of the downsides exist because the only people who are using it in the first place are a bunch of developers that have the technical acumen to take advantage of Linux to its fullest. Second, most interactions with server-side Linux is through the terminal, which Linux was built for anyway. Lastly, and probably the most important, Linux was made to be lightweight, versatile, and highly customizable, meaning that there probably exists a version of Linux out there that meets anyone's exact requirements. And if it doesn't, then you can make one. That's to say that Linux meets the exact use case for servers. The other place Linux dominates is in Android, the world's most popular mobile operating system, right now with roughly 71% of the global market share. And it also happens to be based off Linux. But what makes Android so interesting is that they dominate with the general consumer, not just developers. Why is that? Well, two reasons. First, Android is open source, meaning it is totally free for any manufacturer to install it on a device. And even if you want to pay Google's licensing fee to get a few extra perks, the difference is minimal when you compare it to Apple's renowned Apple tax, making the vast majority of Android phones significantly cheaper than their iOS counterparts. The second reason is that Android is owned by Google, and they have spent the last decade customizing it with features and aesthetic to make it appealing to the average consumer. Unlike the aforementioned Linux desktop operating systems, the user experience is superb, and the Google Play Store has every application for mobile you could possibly imagine, and you even have tons of manufacturers to choose from Sony to Google to Samsung and many more. Essentially, Google plugged in all the holes that the Linux operating system had by investing the time and the resources necessary to develop the operating system with the end user in mind. In conclusion, Linux is just underbaked for your average consumer. Can you make it better to reach the likes of Windows or macOS? Of course, but you're gonna have to spend obscene amounts of money and resources just like Google did. Furthermore, you have to provide some sort of incentive for all the developers of the major desktop applications to build for the platform. Because unless Linux evolves to meet the expectations of consumers, its user base will always be stuck being a niche part of the developer community. Okay guys, thanks for watching another video. Please hit that like button if you want to see more videos like this one. Also, comment down below if you use Linux, what you like about it, what you think can be improved. Again, this is Carlos from Techonomics, over and out.